Hello. As many of you will doubtless know from all of the postings on Facebook and various other forms of social media, several weeks ago a large statue of Manannan, the Irish god of the sea, was stolen from its tourist sighting where it stood looking out over the ocean wave. Unfortunately, it was stolen by religious extremists, and everyone thought the statue had been pretty much lost for good. Thankfully, though, a couple of days ago, the statue was recovered by soldiers out on manoeuvres, and hopefully this will lead to the statue being repaired and replaced, and this time looked after rather more effectively than it was first time round. So, to celebrate the rediscovery of Manannan's statue, this is a tale of the Irish sea god. He only appears in it briefly, but it is one of his important stories. It's the tale of how horses came to Ireland. Long ago, in ancient Ireland, there were no horses, and anyone wishing to travel any distance at all had to do so on foot. One summer, Finn McCall, the famed druid and warrior, was out hunting with his two great hunting hounds, Bhran and Skelown, when word came to him that a fleet of ships had been seen off the coast. Now at once Finn McCall called to him his various warriors, his men, his helpers, and they went rushing down on foot to the coast, and there they saw indeed a fleet of ships sailing the flag of Britain. And a rowboat came to shore, bringing with it a man very well dressed, and behind him a dozen other rowboats with other men also well dressed, though not as grand as the man being sailed across in the lead boat. And his servants helped him ashore, and he introduced himself very courteously, very gracefully, as Arthur, Prince of the Britons. Now this was not the Arthur, King Arthur of great fame. This is much, much earlier, possibly one of his ancestors, one of the early Arthurs. And Arthur, Prince of the Britons, said this was a state visit. He had heard tell of the greatness, the nobility, the fame, the wisdom, the bravery of Finn McCall, and he wished to meet the great man himself. And Finn McCall, naturally enough, with such flattery, invited the Prince of the Britons to come and spend time on the hill of Alma at the great fortress. And he sent word ahead with one of his fastest runners that a banquet should be prepared in honour of this visiting dignitary from the land of Britain. And all the rest of that day was a day of entertainment, of feasting, of hosting, a day in which guest law and host law ruled supreme. Great banquets were laid forth with wild roast boar and roast venison, with breads and cheeses and fruit, and all manner of dishes, with mead flowing and beer flowing and imported wine flowing. Arthur and his men ate and drank, and they told stories, and Finn McCall and his storytellers entertained them, and the jugglers entertained them, and the acrobats and the musicians and the poets and the singers. On and on and on it went. And in between courses, to give themselves a break, they would go out and they would wander the grounds, and Finn McCall would show his guests all the various sites and buildings and sacred trees and special places associated with the hill of Alma. And always accompanying Finn McCall were those two huge great hunting dogs, Bhran and Skelown. And Arthur, Prince of the Britons, was greatly impressed that these two dogs, like Lassie in the film, seemed to understand every single word said to them. In fact, they often seemed to preempt what Finn McCall was about to say to them, and they would carry out the most complicated of tasks. And at the end of the day, as the midnight hour was rolling round, and everyone was heavy in their cups, Arthur, the Prince of the Britons, turned to Finn McCall and said, "What would you take in exchange for these two amazing dogs?" And before Finn McCall could even answer, Arthur summoned his servants over, and with them they brought chests of gold, chests of silver, they brought pearls and emeralds and rubies, they brought polished shields and swords and all manner of gifts to tempt Finn McCall into parting with the two dogs. But, drunk as he was, Finn McCall said, "No, there is no price on earth that will make me exchange these two dogs, because they are not ordinary dogs." And so he told Arthur, Prince of the Britons, the story of how once upon a time his sister had had a magical spell laid upon her. Even though she was heavily pregnant, the vindictive woman who laid this spell transformed her into a dog. And it was in the guise of a dog that his sister gave birth, not to 2 human babies, but to 2 puppies, to Vran and Shkilan. And yet, despite being dogs in form and shape and guise, they were in their minds no different from any human. And ultimately, dogs though they were nonetheless Finn McColl's nephews. And he could no more sell his nephews than he could sell his sisters, than he could sell his cousins, than he could sell any other relative. And conversation went on, became drunker and drunker, and soon Finn McColl and his men and Arthur and his men fell deeply asleep. When Finn McColl awoke sometime around noon the next day, with the mother of all hangovers, he realised that Arthur, Prince of the Britons, was no longer seated in the position of a guest of honour. In fact, he was no longer seated anywhere, nor were any of his men to be seen seated around the hall. And at first, as he staggered up, scratching his head and feeling bleary and much the worse for wear, Finn McColl assumed that Arthur must have gone outside, perhaps for a walk, maybe to freshen himself up. And so he went out to search for his guest, to see if there was anything he needed. And he couldn't find him. So he sent his men out to search further afield. Perhaps they'd gone off riding, perhaps they'd gone off hunting, perhaps they'd gone off walking in the woods. Who could tell? But high and low as the men searched, there was no sign whatsoever of Arthur or any of his men, or of Ram and Shkilan. And never once in all the days of their long canine lives had Ram and Shkilan deserted Finn McColl's side. And suddenly, amidst the fugue of his hangover, the penny dropped. He realised what must have happened. And Finn McColl was not only a great druid and a brave warrior, but he was a skilled hunter, a skilled tracker. And he followed the tracks made by the feet of Arthur and his many men as they had roamed off back down towards the coast. And there, where the ships should have been berthed, was nothing. The ships were gone, the men were gone, the dogs were gone, stolen by this most dishonourable of guests. The men of the Fina, the warrior band that served Finn McColl, were besides themselves with rage and distress and grief at the loss of their canine companions. But what could any of them do? They had no ships, they could hardly swim out after the disappeared ships, they had no means of tracking where these absconding Britons had gone. And so Finn McColl, drawing upon his knowledge as a druid, waded out into the shallows of the ocean, and with the sea lapping around his calves, he began to summon, to call, to chant, to pray to the Lord of the Ocean Wave himself, and all of the other warriors and druids and sages of the Fina began to beat on their drums, began to stamp their spears against the shingle of the sand of the beach, began to chant in unison with Finn McColl. And to that length the ocean wave itself began to boil and bubble and twist and turn, and forming out of the very water itself there arose a gigantic figure. A figure that seemed to be part human, part fish, part whale, shifting and turning with the very ocean current itself. It was Manannan MacLear. And looking down at the tiny human before him, Manannan MacLear said, "What do you call me for?" And Finn McColl explained all that had happened. And Manannan MacLear was as outraged as Finn McColl was, and said, "This violation of guest law cannot go unpunished. I will provide you with a ship. I will provide you with my very own vessel, the Wave Sweeper. But alas," said Finn McColl, I have never stepped foot in a boat before. None of my men are sailors. We have no idea how to rig a ship, how to sail a ship. Do not worry, said Manannan clear. For the wave sweeper steers itself, sets its own sails. It will cut across the ocean wave. All you need do is sit upon it. And just as Vran and Shkelan may follow a track, a scent across grass, so the wave sweeper can track a scent across water. And with that, Manannan Maclear sank back down and dissipated into the ocean from which he was formed. And there, on the far horizon, coming towards them at great speed, was the enormous ship, the wave sweeper. And when it was close enough to shore, Finn McCall and his men waded out to sea, clambered up the rigging onto the ship itself. And exactly as the ocean god had said, the ship turned itself around and sped off at tremendous speed across the ocean wave without Finn or any of his men needing to do anything to make the ship move. Hither and yon it went far and far and far away, following whatever wake, whatever scent might be carried upon the ocean wave. Neither Finn or any of his men understood the way of it. And to that length there came a great island on the horizon, and the ship made its way to that island, steered itself around the coast of the island until it came to a bay, and in that bay they saw already berthed the ships of Arthur and his men. And the wave sweeper came in close enough for Finn McCall and his men to jump overboard and swim the little distance to the shore itself. For the ships of Arthur and the Britons were empty. Clearly they had already disembarked and gone onto this island itself. And Finn McCall was once again able to employ his skills as a hunter to follow the passage made by these absconding warriors, follow them up the path, up to a high hill rise, and there they looked down, and by now the day had grown long, and the evening was coming, and darkness was descending, and looking down over the hill they saw the light of several campfires lit, and there they saw Arthur and his men sitting around these various campfires. Clearly none the wiser that they were being spied upon. Well, Finn signalled, using the silent gestures, the language of the bards, to his men, who understood that sign language, signalled to them to be silent and to be patient and to wait, until it got darker and darker and darker, and they could hear the men raucously laughing, singing, boasting of their doings and their deeds, drinking and eating and feasting, until the Britons fell into a deep and drunken slumber for the second night in a row. And when the men had all passed out in their cups, then Finn McCall and his warriors descended upon them like a grey silent fog in the dark, descended upon them and waited for the dawn's sunlight to rise. And as dawn stretched its fingers across the island that was sacred to the sea god, the Isle of Man, the Isle of Manannan Maclear, Finn McCall and his men prodded Arthur and his men awake, their swords, their daggers, their axes drawn and already at the barely conscious men's throats. And Arthur, realising he had been captured, at once said, "You've come for your dogs. I was wrong to take them, but the temptation overcame me." And he gestured off to a tree to one side where Vran and Shkelan were chained, snarling and snapping and straining at the chains to get free and to be with their uncle, their master. Arthur, Prince of the Britons, reassured Finn McCall that the dogs were unharmed. He had intended to keep them for his own, to be his own pets, but such was their loyalty to Finn McCall that they had been unmanageable since the very moment when they had been abducted and taken from the hall. "I demand compensation," said Finn McCall. "Not only the restoration of my nephews, my dogs, but I demand more in compensation, for it was the way of the Breon laws in Ireland, and also the way of the laws of the British too, that any thief caught would not only have to repay the goods that were stolen, but 3 times the value of the goods that were stolen. "What do you want?" said Arthur, Prince of the Britons, thinking of the chests of silver and gold and rubies and pearls and emeralds, of the polished shields and the ornate swords that he had already tried to tempt Finn McCall with the day before. "None of that," said Finn McCall, looking round himself. "When you came to us first time, you had with you strange beasts, and you said you could ride these beasts, though we never saw you do it. Where are these beasts?" Well, Arthur gestured to a distant field, where Finn McCall could see these strange, large, long-legged, long-necked creatures. 12 of them in the paddock. These things, what was it you called them? Some strange word. And Arthur said, they are horses. They are abundant in Britain. You want horses? You want our horses? You can have our horses if you allow us to go unharmed. Well, Finn McCall was not a greedy man, and said to Arthur, Prince of the Britons, "We will take a breeding pair, a male and a female. You may keep the rest. And when you return to Britain, take with you word, not only of all of the bravery and the courage and the wisdom and the daring that you have already heard tell of Finn McCall, but also take with you word of our honesty, of our compassion in allowing you to go, of our goodness in forgiving you your trespass." And at once Arthur, Prince of the Britons, agreed he would do all of this and more, and gladly handed over a stallion and a mare. And Finn McCall took his men and the stallion and the mare and his 2 dogs, and they went back to the bay, where the wave sweeper, the ship of Manannan was still waiting for them. And all of them, with some difficulty getting the horses on board, clambered aboard the ship, and the wave sweeper took off and restored them back to the very beach from which it had first departed. And so the very first stallion, the very first mare, came to Ireland, and from that breeding pair, it is said, all of the other horses that were in Ireland up until present times, when racing horses and so forth were imported from other parts of the world, all of the native ponies and horses of Ireland stemmed from those first 2, those inadvertent gifts of Manannan. Thank you.